2024 Brobber 17 Foxd. Okay. So I struggled with the last section about the if we jump back to page 128 real quick, the probability of a conjunction of two independent events is the product of the probabilities of each. Of course, the trap in the conjunction formula lies in the proviso independent, because it has to be two independent events. It is not a conjunction. You don't do that multiplication for that conjunction if it's just two events. And so they give some examples of that, like families that want their kids to be the same gender, or that only want girls or only want boys or whatever. Well, those are the options. And then now do we understand the neighborhood watch thing yet? Okay, when a streak of rare occurrences pops up in entities that are not quarantined from one another, such as the occupants of a building who give each other colds, then the set of observations is in effect a single event, not a freakish run of events, and their probabilities may be multiplied. On page 129, by the way. Oh, may not be multiplied. Is that what I said? Yeah. May not be multiplied. Right. So it shouldn't be like, whoa, 100 people in this building have colds. That's crazy. Because, gosh, the chances of one getting a cold was 5%, and then of that one, and then of that one, and then of that one. Whoa, that's so unlikely. That's crazy. No, you can't. You wouldn't say that, because it's a single event. It's whether the building got the virus in it or not, I guess. All right. For example, if the crime rate was below average in each of the 12 months after neighborhood watch signs were posted in a city, it would be a mistake to conclude that the run must be due to the signage rather than chance. Okay. Right. Crime rates change slowly. That part, yeah, okay, yeah. And then the patterns in 1 month carry over to the next. But I don't understand why okay, we can't say it must be due to the signage. But can we take it as evidence that the signage it was useful? Probability? All right. Let's just carry on. Okay. In the legal arena, misapplying the formula for a conjunction is not just a math error, but a miscarriage of justice. A notorious example is the bogus Meadows Law, named after a British pediatrician who declared that when crib deaths within a family are examined, 1 is a tragedy, 2 is suspicious, and 3 is murder unless there is proof to the contrary. In the 1999 case of the attorney Sally Clark, who had lost 2 infant sons, the doctor testified that since the probability of a crib death in an affluent, non-smoking family is 1 in 8,500, the probability of 2 crib deaths is the square of that number, 1 in 72 million. Clark was sentenced to life imprisonment for murder. Appalled statisticians pointed out the mistake. Crib deaths within a family are not independent because siblings may share a genetic predisposition, the home may have elevated risk factors, and the parents may have reacted to the first tragedy by taking misguided precautions that increase the chance of a second. Clark was released after a second appeal on different grounds, and in the following years, hundreds of cases based on similar errors had to be reviewed. Another howler in calculating conjunctions. I love that word howler. It's on my wall. A howler that's like a false proof of something. What's a howler? Oh, a stupid or glaring mistake, especially an amusing one. No, I could have sworn there was something about a false proof. Howler mathematics. Yeah, bogus proofs. In mathematics, certain kinds of mistaken proof are often blah blah mathematical fallacy. Where do we get to howler stuff? Howlers. Examples exist of mathematically correct results derived by incorrect lines of reasoning. Such an argument, however true the conclusion appears to be, is mathematically invalid and is commonly known as a howler. All right, and then they have this. Let's see. Let's take a photo now of my post-it because it's the same example. Okay. So we canceled out the sixes, which you can't obviously do. You can't cancel out digits. We canceled out the sixes, and we happen to get 1/4, which is a true reduction of 16/64. But but how we got there is bullshit, and that I love because of how often the system, of how often the mental operators can get to the, or no, not can get to the, how often their conclusion is right, but the way that they got there is importantly wrong. Which means, and obviously if they're getting there the wrong way, then they don't have a general enough sort of understanding or true approach. Because then if you did the same thing with, 26/64, well, you get half, and that's no good. Okay, obviously. Another howler in calculating conjunctions had a cameo in the bizarre attempt by Donald Trump and his supporters to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election based on baseless claims of voter fraud. In a motion filed with the U.S. Supreme Court, the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton wrote, "The probability of former Vice President Biden winning the popular vote in the 4 defendant states, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, independently given President Trump's early lead in those states as of 3 a.m. on November 4th, 2020, is less than 1 in a quadrillion, or 1 in a quadrillion. For former Vice President Biden to win these 4 states collectively, the odds of that event happening decreased to less than 1 in a quadrillion to the 4th power." Paxton's jaw-dropping math assumed that the votes being tallied over the course of the counting were statistically independent, like repeated rolls of a die. But urbanites tend to vote differently from suburbanites, who in turn vote differently from country folk. And in-person voters differ from those who mail in their ballots, particularly in 2020 when Trump discouraged his supporters from voting by mail. Within each sector, the votes are not independent and the base rates differ from sector to sector. Since the results from each precinct are announced as they become available and the mail-in ballots are counted later still, then as the different tranches are added up, the running tally favoring each candidate can rise or fall, and the final result cannot be extrapolated from the interim ones. The flapdoodle was raised to the 4th power when Paxton multiplied the bogus probabilities from the 4 states, whose votes are not independent either. Whatever sways voters in the Great Lakes state is also likely to sway them in America's Disneyland. Statistical independence is tied to the concept of, this is a new subsection, there are a few paragraph breaks here. Okay. Statistical independence is tied to the concept of causation. If one event affects another, they are not statistically independent, though, as we shall see, the converse isn't true. Events that are causally isolated may be statistically dependent. Okay. Statistical independence is tied to the concept of causation. If one event affects another, they are not statistically independent. Though, as we shall see, the converse isn't true. Events that are causally isolated may be statistically dependent. That is why the gambler's fallacy is a fallacy. One spin of a roulette wheel cannot impinge on the next, so the high roller who expects a run of blacks to set up a red will lose his shirt. The probability is always a bit less than 0.5 because of the green slots with 0 and 0, 0, 00. This shows that fallacies of statistical independence can go both ways, falsely assuming independence, as in Meadows' fallacy, and falsely assuming dependence, as in the gambler's fallacy. Whether events are independent is not always obvious. Among the most famous applications of research on cognitive biases to everyday life was Tversky's analysis, with the social psychologist Tom Gilovich, of the hot hand in basketball. Every Hoops fan knows that from time to time a player can be quote-unquote on fire, quote-unquote in the zone, or unconscious, especially streak shooters like Vinny the Microwave Johnson, the 1980s Detroit Pistons guard who earned his sobriquet because he heats up in a hurry. In the teeth of incredulity from every fan, coach, player, and sports writer, Tversky and Gilovich claimed that the hot hand was an illusion, a gambler's fallacy in reverse. The data they analyzed suggested that the outcome of every attempt is statistically independent of the preceding run of attempts. Now, before looking at the data, one cannot blow off the possibility of a hot hand on the grounds of causal plausibility in the way one can blow off the gambler's fallacy. Unlike a roulette wheel, a player's body and brain do have a memory, and it is far from superstitious to think that a spurt of energy or confidence might persist over a span of minutes. All right, good. I'm glad that was said. So let's see how it's adjusted. So it was not a breach of the scientific worldview when other statisticians took a second look at the data and concluded that the Boffins were wrong and the jocks were right. There is a hot hand in basketball. Yeah, I'm a little bit disappointed in you, Kahneman. How did you, and it's funny because I when you told me about it, Kahneman, in your, I guess you were talking about Tversky's research. When you told me about it, I was with you. And other books often talk about the fallacy of the hot hand. And I've never doubted it. But Pinker, you set it up nicely here, talking about the roulette wheel, and then it was like, you slapped the right its for me for the first time to go, wait a minute. A hot hand, of course it could be real. So yeah, so I would let's see. I don't know what's gonna end up happening here, right? We're on this adventure together, so let's see whether it's real or not. But I am having trouble now to understanding how I could ever have thought that was an illusion. The economists Joshua Miller and Adam Sangiorgio showed that when you select streaks of hits or misses from a long run of data, the outcome of the very next attempt is not statistically independent of that streak. The reason is that if the attempt had happened to be successful and continued the streak, it might have been counted as part of that streak in the first place. The reason is that if the attempt had happened to be successful and continued the streak, it might have been counted as part of that streak in the first place. The economists Joshua Miller and Adam Sangiorgio showed that when you select streaks of hits or misses from a long run of data, the outcome of the very next attempt is not statistically independent of that streak. So you select a streak from a long run of data, the next shot they take is correlated to their streak, whether it's of hits or of misses. If it was a streak of hits, that next shot is more likely to be a hit. If it's a streak of misses, that next shot is more likely to be a miss. And the reason for that is that if the ah ah gotcha. So you have to have some minimum definition of a streak. Right, you can't like look at a streak, count every hit in it as part of the streak, and then go, and then what happened? Because yeah, okay, then if you just included all the hits in your streak, then yeah, then the next thing is going to be a miss, or vice versa. I see. The reason is that if the attempt had happened to be successful and continue the streak, it might have been counted as a part of that streak in the first place. No way Tversky would have overlooked something like that. Come on, what's going on here? Any attempt which is singled out because it took place following a streak is biased to be an unsuccessful attempt, one that had no chance of being defined as part of the streak itself. That throws off the calculations of what one should expect by chance, which in turn throws off the conclusion that basketball players are no streakier than roulette wheels. The hot hand fallacy has 3 lessons. First, events can be statistically independent not only when one event causally impinges on the other. First, events can be statistically dependent not only when one event causally impinges on the other, but when it affects which event is selected for comparison. Second, the gambler's fallacy may arise from a not so irrational feature of perception. When we look for streaks in a long run of events, a streak of a given length really is likelier to be reversed than to continue. Second, the gambler's fallacy may arise from a not so irrational feature of perception. All right, so let's phrase this as an it. So, an it that people in the field might have considered a mallet. But here's Pinker, the champion of human rationality, the great defender of humans from me. And he's saying this mallet might not be such a mallet, bro. The gambler's fallacy is a mallet, but it may arise from a bonnet. And that tends to be the case. Yeah, the roots of most of our sort of biases, fallacies, heuristics, and illusions. It's like, oh yeah, no, like that's a good rule to have, but it's just it's being over applied, or in this case, it's not adaptive. Okay. So when we look for streaks in a long run of events, a streak of a given length really is likelier to be reversed than to continue. A streak of a given length. What do you mean, like a long length? Because I talked about giving a length earlier. But I was like, if you set it at 3, if you define a streak as 3, then you won't see the same statistical independence that you had seen when you consider the streak whatever fell into the streak. But I don't think we're talking about the same given now. So there are some length for which it becomes more likely to be reversed than to continue. Gosh, because okay, so the error of the gambler may be a product of the not so erroneous thing after this colon. Okay, all right, let's do this again. So, the gambler's fallacy. So the gambler's fallacy is, the gambler's fallacy isn't the hot hand fallacy. The gambler's fallacy is like, at some point, this has to stop. Too much coincidence. At some point, this has to stop. And that is true with there is a point at which straight, if you're always talking about the same length of streaks, then yeah. Then if so, okay, yeah. So if you look at all the streaks of 4 and are like, so what happened next? Was it reversed or continued? It is more likely to be reversed when you have these independent events like a roulette wheel. But it's just thinking that it has to be reversed, because then no. But sure, it is more likely to be reversed. Gotcha. So the gambler's fallacy is the commitment to the reversal because of past events. But it's not because of past events that it's going to reverse. It's going to reverse because it's generally just 50% and isn't based on the past events. Right, and that's why the hot hand and the gambler's thing are like opposites. The hot hand is like, oh, because they've been hitting, they're going to continue to hit. Gambler's fallacy is because they've been hitting, they're going to now miss. Right. No, you explained it well. That's me. Okay, I gotcha. So the error of because they've been hitting, they're going to miss. Well, it's not actually an error because there are psychological factors of the hitter involved. So it does carry over. These aren't independent events. So that's why it's a hot hand fallacy. Now the gambler's fallacy actually does involve independent events. But they, like the hot hand fallacy, think that the past matters. They just think that it's going to have the opposite effect. Or not they, but there's this it. Okay, got it. So there are a few different its here. So if streak, so we got a few different its. If streak, then stop. Now if streak, then change. Now, that's not irrational. Because especially for independent events, it's like, alright, well, it's got to change soon, bro. Because there's no confounding thing to make it keep going like that. Alright. Another it is if streak, then continue. Like the streak will continue. Then streak continue. Or events continue. And then the other one is events change. So you've got one it called if events in streak, then events soon change. So if streak, then change. Another it that's saying the opposite. If streak, then streak, bro. If streak, then streak. That's a better way to put it. If streak, then streak. Or then continue, I don't know. Okay. Now, why did we evolve to have if streak, then events change? Well, because we evolved with such a thing as independent events. Like, for instance, I don't bloody know. Or we've evolved in our algorithms is allowance for independence of events. So for instance, I don't know, these are not great examples, but if like you're hunting and you throw your spear and you miss twice, like give it another go. It could have just been, in that case, it could have been you, yes, but it could have just been the wind. It could have been some fluke. So don't be like, oh no, I'm not able to throw. No, give it another go, dude. So that's why we have if streak, then events change. And also, it's just good, like, people would be suicidal if we didn't have that. If we didn't have sort of a natural instinct that that a series of bad events are eventually going to get better. That's the problem with suicidal people, right? It's like, first of all, they don't notice some of the good things. Second of all, they exaggerate some of the bad things. And then third of all, whatever bad things there actually are that they may have exaggerated. And because they're not seeing the interruptions with good things, they're thinking that's the streak, and then they don't have the right architecture. The chemistry isn't feeding the it that says, "Oh, well, it's bound to change soon." And so they're like, "Well, it's just going to continue like this." I gotcha. That's great. Okay. Now we also evolved with if streak then streak, bro. If streak then continue. It's also a good one because there are lots of situations in life where it's like, if we see a couple examples of a thing, let's assume the sequence, the pattern, especially if we see, yeah. And that's going to help with the in-group, out-group, or it's going to help with the out-group bias. Now, of course, we're not perfectly rational, so it's not like we only, the if streak then change, it only gets slapped when we know that the things are independent. Wait, hold on. So, the gambler's fallacy is that he is taking into consideration past events when those don't actually affect the odds. On the other hand, it is generally true. It might not be true in any given instance, but it is generally true that streaks of independent events don't last. So the problem in the gambler's mind, in the gambler's system, what we're dealing with here, so he has if streak, then events change, and that's fine. And so if he wants to take a long run of data and he takes a look at he doesn't take a look at the data. If he wants to talk to the casino about the last 1,000 spins they did, and he didn't see them, and he wants to bet on whether after a fourth consecutive red there was then a black or not, he can make that bet. That would be a rational bet. To say, I'll bet you, casino, that if we look at if you're after your 1,000 spins, and we pick out every time there are 4 consecutive reds, I bet the 5th one is black. He would win that bet. So the problem isn't about the independence thing. I mean, it is for the gambler's fallacy. He's thinking he's taking this particular case and saying, well, look, this past behavior means that this has to. Here we go. Take my mortgage or whatever. Take my. So it's an over application. Yeah, it's an abuse of a general tendency. General tendency is the 5th one would be different than the previous 4. Okay, very good. All right. So it's just, and we know that the brain is simple, and so anyway, all right. So basically, if streak, then events change. That it just straight up delivers. It doesn't get, and it shouldn't. If streak, then streak has no business rationally speaking, competing with if streak, then change. Not in this situation. However, we do tend to, see agency in everything around us. So I could imagine at a roulette table, an individual, or it can be a couple, but let's say an individual, that's a little bit more interesting. A single person, they have if streak, then events change, who's really hyping up his let's bet on black. Let's say it's been red. Let's bet on black behavior, it. And then if streak, and then also in his brain, in his system, there may be if streak, both of these being triggered by the fact that he's looking at a streak. If streak, then the streak has to continue. And so it probably is quite a common occurrence that I'd gamble that because the brain isn't integrated, both of these its can be slapped and compete with each other in a human brain, even though rationally they shouldn't. Because if streak then events change should only be solicited by sort of mostly independent events, should only be slapped by a series of independent events. And if streak then continue should be quiet. Whereas when the events are dependent, if streak then events change should be silent in a rational brain, and if streak then continues streak has, a little bit more reason to be talking. But the human brain is neither integrated nor rational. And so even if the knowledge in the brain exists that these are independent events, that knowledge is not necessarily going to pi, which means to reduce or inhibit, if streak then if streak then continue. It's not necessarily going to pi that while hyping if streak then events change. We're talking about the knowledge yit that there is a streak, that's one yit, and another yit that the events are independent. So those two its can exist in the brain. I don't really know how to phrase knowledge its. I think it's just a reciprocal thing. So you would say or if I've observed that there's a streak, then there's a streak. Okay, that's one yit, and another yit is if these events are independent of each other, then they are independent of each other. Okay, so a reciprocal one, or you can use the same observation formula. Okay, in a perfectly rational integrated brain, then the fact that we're in front of a roulette wheel would slap the independent events yet, which would in turn of the two streak its slap the if streak then events should change it. And then of course in a really smart brain that's also integrated and rational, there would be another one going, wait a minute, but that's, if there is a probability, don't confuse that with a certainty. Okay, all right. So we see how we can even rationally get to the gambler's fallacy. When we just drop out that last bit of understanding the difference between a tendency and a certainty. Okay. But I'll bet, so ask your gambling whoever, I'll bet that despite their knowing that these are, god damn it. Yes, right, okay. So actually, you don't have to just take off the last piece. You can say that if streak then events change is not actually a true it. It is true of a tendency of it in general, but it is not a conclusion that can be drawn about any particular case. It's not a conclusion that can be bet on for a particular case. And that's where it becomes a fallacy, because this it is being applied to a particular case. Right. It is being applied to a particular case. And that's what makes it a mallet. It is not adaptive to that demand, to that specific case. It's only good for talking about a general tendency, okay? But anyway, because the gambler isn't integrated, he does know its chance. There are its there that yet does exist in him. These are independent events. We cannot judge the next event based on the behavior of the previous events. That exists in the gambler's mind. But also what exists is if streak then events change. And that's the one that Sir livers to get the gambler to bet on a case, even though elsewhere in the brain it's known that that's not reasonable. All right. Anyway, here's what I bet, though. I bet there's also people who just feel totally torn and just really uncomfortable. But they probably don't end up being gamblers, actually. They probably don't like going to the casino, because they get there and they've got the one it going, if streak, then it's bound to change. And the other it going, if streak, then it's going to continue like this. Neither of those, yeah, okay. I'm getting a little bit mixed up, but all right. So that's really interesting, and hopefully there were some seeds of something in there. And I gotta start doing Twitch so someone can just comment and help me out, finish the thought for me. All right, very good. If streak, then streak is typically only applicable to dependent events. If streak, then events. Then no streak, it's only applicable to independent events. But still, neither is applicable to the very next event. Both of these really are should be just talking about probability. But the human mind is simple. In this millennia, anyway. Let's end all past ones. Let's turn to the probability of a disjunction of events. Probability A or B. It is the probability of A plus the probability of B minus the probability of both A and B. If the Browns have 2 children, the probability that at least one is a girl, that is, that the first is a girl or the second is a girl, is 0.5 plus 0.5 minus 0.25 or 0.75. You can arrive at the same result by counting the combinations boy-girl plus girl-girl plus girl-boy, 3 possibilities, out of boy-girl plus boy-boy plus girl-boy plus girl-girl, 4 opportunities. Or by tallying frequencies in a large set of families with 2 children, you'll find that 3/4 have at least 1 daughter. The arithmetic of OR shows us what went wrong with the weathercaster who said it was certain to rain over the weekend because there was a 50% chance of rain on each day. By simply adding the 2 probabilities, he inadvertently double counted the weekends on which it could rain on both days, neglecting to subtract 0.25 for the conjunction. The arithmetic of OR shows us what went wrong with the weathercaster who said it was certain to rain over the weekend because there was a 50% chance of rain on each day. By simply adding the 2 probabilities, he inadvertently double counted the weekends on which it would rain on both days, neglecting to subtract 0.25 for the conjunction. Right. 50% on Saturday, on Foxty, 50% on Goldie. Right. It's not a separate. Right. Right. And it becomes clear when you list out the things. If it rains on Foxty Goldie, so rain, 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 no rain, no rain, rain, no rain, no rain. And you see clearly 75%. Right. So you can't double count. Okay, sure. He applied a rule that works for exclusive OR, namely A or B but not both. The probabilities of mutually exclusive events can be added to get the disjunction, and the sum of all of them is 1, certainty. The probabilities of mutually exclusive events can be added to get the disjunction, and the sum of all of them is 1, certainty. The probability that a child is either a boy, 0.5, or a girl, 0.5, is their sum, 1, since the child must be either one or the other. This being an example to explain the math, I've adopted a gender binary and not considered intersex children. If you forget the difference and confuse overlapping with mutually exclusive events, you can get crazy results. Imagine the weathercaster predicting a 0.5 chance of rain on Saturday, on Sunday, and on Monday, and concluding that the chance of rain over the long weekend was 1.5. Obviously, gosh, we're really not rational. Because I am struggling, bro. And that felt like a punch in the gut, how silly it would be if we just add another day. I did see that sort of coming. Okay. Alright. Not really, maybe. Anyway, because of the hindsight bias, we're just going to discount that. Okay. But what about this exclusive or? The probabilities of mutually exclusive events can be added to get the disjunction. The probability that a child is either a boy, 0.5, or a girl, 0.5, is their sum 1, since the child must be either one. Right. But it can, like, rain. It can... Whatever. The probability of the complement of an event, namely A not happening, is 1 minus the probability of it happening. This comes in handy when we have to estimate the probability of at least one event. Remember the Browns with their daughter, or perhaps two? Since having at least one daughter is the same as not having all sons, then instead of calculating the disjunction, first child is a girl, or second child is a girl, we could have calculated the complement of a conjunction, 1 minus the chance of having all boys, which is 0.25, namely 0.75. In the case of two events, it doesn't make much difference which formula we use. But when we have to calculate the probability of at least one A in a large set, the disjunction rule requires the tedium of adding and subtracting a lot of combinations. It's easier to calculate it as the probability of not all not A, which is simply 1 minus a big product. I basically checked that. I'm just reading it for you guys. I'm hoping, it looks like we're going to get it. This is going to stop soon. Suppose, for example, that every year there's a 10% chance of a war breaking out. What are the chances of at least one war breaking out over a decade? Let's assume that wars are independent, not contagious, which seems to be true. Instead of adding up the chance that a war will break out in year 1 plus the chance that it will break out in year 2 minus the chance that one will break out in both year 1 and year 2 and so on for all combinations, we can simply calculate the chance that no war will break out over all of the years and subtract it from 1. That is simply the chance that war will not break out in a given year, 0.9, multiplied by itself for each of the other years. 0.9 times 0.9 times 0.9, or 0.9 to the 10th, which equals 0.35, which when subtracted from 1 yields 0.65. Sure. Finally, we get to a conditional probability. I think that, if you ask me questions to test my understanding of this, no, I can't make any promises. Because I don't know whether it's just I'm just not connecting with these words. And not because it's these words, but just because my brain doesn't connect well with math words. But my brain, I think, is good at sort of math or something. I mean, it can't be because it got hard in school with the words. But anyway, moving on. Finally, we get to a conditional probability. The probability of A given B, written as prob bar B. A conditional probability is conceptually simple. It's just the probability of the then in an if-then. It's also arithmetically simple. Oh, thank God. Okay, thank God. I'll let someone else deal with the so-its. In a previous video, we named the disjunctive its as the so-its, coming from the word soit, S-O-I-T, in French, which means either, and then soaks it for the exclusive. Okay, so anyway, so back to our normal its of just given a certain thing, there's a then. It's also arithmetically simple. It's just the probability of A and B divided by the probability of B. Nonetheless, it's the source of endless confusions, blunders, and paradoxes in reasoning about probability, starting with a hapless fellow in the XKCD cartoon on the following page. Crack! Boom! Whoa, we should get inside.
That's okay. Lightning only kills about 45 Americans a year, so the chances of dying are only 1 in 7 million. Let's go on.
The annual death rate among people who know that statistic is 1 in 6. His error lies in confusing the simple probability or base rate of lightning deaths, prob struck by lightning, with the conditional probability of a lightning death given that one is outside during an electrical storm. Probability struck by lightning bar outside in storm. Though the arithmetic of a conditional probability is simple, it's unintuitive until we make it concrete. It's unintuitive, meaning sort of our natural its don't, or our natural its and the sum they currently make don't really align with it. Now, we might have its that very much align with this concept, but there's maybe interference from other its that are not aligned with it. That's what, by the way, unintuitive means. So back to page 134. Though the arithmetic of a conditional probability is simple, it's 135 unintuitive until we make it concrete and visualizable, as always. Look at the Venn diagrams on the page after the next one, where the size of a region on the page corresponds to the number of outcomes. The rectangle with an area of 1 embraces all the possibilities. A circle encloses all the A's, and the top left figure shows that the probability of A corresponds to its area, dark, as a proportion of the whole rectangle, pale. Sure. As a proportion of the whole rectangle, pale. Another way of saying the number of occurrences divided by the number of opportunities. The top right figure shows the probability of A or B, which is the total dark area, namely the area of A plus the area of B without double counting the wedge in the middle they share. That is the probability of A and B. That wedge, probability A and B, is shown in the lower left diagram. The bottom right diagram explains the deal with conditional probabilities. It indicates that we should ignore the vast space of everything that can possibly happen, bleached into white, and focus our attention only on the incidents in which B happens, the shaded circle. 136. Now we scrutinize how many of those incidents are ones in which A also happens, the size of the A and B wedge as a proportion of the size of the B circle. Of all the interludes in which people walk in an electrical storm, B, what proportion of them result in a lightning strike? A and B. That's why we calculate the conditional prob A bar B by dividing the conjunction, prob A and B, into the base rate, prob B. The bottom right image is not different from the bottom left one. The shaded areas are the same. Is that normal? It's not just the words. All right, hold on. Let me put this gum somewhere. All right. All right, look. All right, let's just look at these two diagrams for a second. All right, so A of on the left represents the chances of A happening, and B represents the chances of B happening. And A and B represent the smaller chance of both of them happening. Very good. Now in the bottom right-hand corner, or the one that you're looking at now, maybe, or the right side one, I don't know, we have two circles, the probability of A happening, another circle, the probability of B happening, and then we have their conjunction shaded, the probability of both of them happening, or in other words, the probability of A in the cases that there is... right, in the cases that there is B. Right, but it's just graphically, you're still looking at a dark shaded area and comparing it to the rectangle. I feel like there should be something in the picture to be like, to gray out the outline of circles A and of the rectangle. And be like, yo, we're talking about just the B circle, the proportion of it that is dark. You know, which is much higher than... Yeah, gotcha. Cool. Okay, great. Here's an example. The Greys have two children. The elder is a girl. Knowing this, what is the probability that both are girls? Let's translate the question into a conditional probability. Namely, the probability that the first is a girl and the second is a girl, given that the first is a girl. Or in fancy notation, prob first equals girl and second equals girl, bar first equals girl. The formula tells us to divide the conjunction, which we already calculated to be 0.25, by the simple probability for the second child, 0.5, and we get 0.5. Or thinking classically and concretely, girl, girl, one possibility, divided by girl, girl, and girl, boy, two opportunities, equals 1/2. Very good. So this has to do with the Monty Hall, right?